if I didn't take this moment right now. It's February the 14th, and I don't mean to be cheesy about it. I mean to be very, very sincere. I just want to take 1 minute right now and say happy Valentine's Day to my unbelievable wife. I love her so much. I'm so grateful for her that she's in my life. I definitely won the wife lotto, and am very, very excited that she agreed to marry me and that we're still married and that all the great things are happening. So, Julie, happy Valentine's Day. I love you. And I wouldn't want to be going through this crazy adventure with anybody else. I do have a special gift for you. Since it's Valentine's Day, we're supposed to give flowers. And so there's snow on the ground, so I couldn't pick anything out of the garden. So I went to the fridge and I got some cauliflower. Come on, that's a good joke. That's a good joke. I'm not really giving my wife cauliflower for Valentine's Day. I just thought that was funny. I do want to dig right into the lesson for time's sake. We have a lot to cover. So I'm going to just share my screen here and get us back into our series. So we've been doing this series now for several weeks. I think we're into lesson number 13. I think we're in week 7 or week 6 of doing the series, The Bible is a Book. And, I think when you hear somebody say the Bible is a book, the first thing you want to say is, well, duh. Of course it is. But I do think that we sometimes view it as a maybe a compilation of many books, which it also is, but it's in and of itself, it is a book. It is a book with main characters, with a main theme, with an overarching plot. And so we've been focusing for the last several weeks on that specific topic, discussing the Bible as a standalone book and looking at the over kind of meta narrative of the entire Bible. And hopefully by doing that, we dig into that together, this deeper dive into this, what I call a meta narrative. It helps you in your personal Bible studies to glean even more from your deeper dive into every specific scripture. Obviously, when we're covering this much material in such a short time, we're just doing as Kurt calls it, the highlights of the highlights. We're covering the highlights of the highlights. So it's definitely, very, very top level. So the premise that we've been kind of presenting, and I think that we've all kind of collaborated around, is this notion that the Bible has, as I said before, the main character, God, man, and the relationship with mankind, and then the enemy, Satan, the conflict there because evil in the world through Satan. So that's your basic premise of the plot conflict. And then in Genesis chapter 12, God lays out these promises to Abraham. And we look at that as kind of like the table of contents for the rest of what we've been talking about. Everything we've been focusing on and kind of presenting through this series has been under this umbrella of this concept that God is a God who makes his promises, he repeats his promises, and most importantly, he keeps his promises. And so I do want to review very quickly these promises that God made to Abraham. First, he says, I will bless you. And then he says, I will make your name great. And then he says, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. Now, we're going to go through the other 4 in just a minute, but we see from basically the time God makes these promises to Abraham, he begins to immediately fulfill them. Now, Abraham has his own sets of challenges, and he has his ups and downs, and we learned a lot about that. But the book of Genesis, the rest of the book of Genesis is God keeping and then repeating these promises to Abraham's children, to Isaac, and then ultimately to Jacob. But again, I'll bless you. I'll make your name great. I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And then he says, I'll make you a great nation. And that's really what we see happening in the book of Exodus. And he says, I'm going to give you this promised land, which is what we see happening. He in Exodus through Deuteronomy, he lays out, he builds a great nation with not only the people, but also the structure, the government, the laws. And then in Joshua and Judges, they actually go into this promised land. And later in Genesis, God promises Abraham, he says, kings will come from you. And we see that happen in 1st and 2nd Samuel as first Saul is appointed, and then the Davidic kingdom, all descendants Abraham, and kings come from him. We see that play out through 1st and 2nd Samuel, and even 1st and 2nd Kings demonstrates God's fulfillment of this promise, even though, as we learned last week, in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, they start to fall short. The people start to fall short of their side of the deal, their side of the covenant, and there are consequences to that, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But again, we see God fulfilling these promises. And so far, that's really been what the entire layout of the story that we've read up to this point has been, God fulfilling these promises. And today we talk about God reviving this promise and restoring this promise in the hearts and minds of the Israelite people. But ultimately, there's the seventh promise, which is the messianic promise. All nations on earth will be blessed through you. And we haven't gotten to that part of the story yet, but that's really what people are gearing up for. There's a level of anticipation. Imagine if you grew up in a society where for a couple thousand years, your entire narrative around you was around these promises, that you're here because of these promises. Oh, and we're still waiting for the last promise to be fulfilled. Incredibly exciting amount of anticipation around this. But all these promises were delivered in a covenant form. What's a covenant? A covenant's an agreement. God is saying, I will do all of these things, and all I want from you is obedience. All I want from you in return is devotion, a relationship with you. So we do have a role in the fulfillment of these promises, and that we need to follow through on that covenant relationship. And that's really kind of what the scriptures have been about so far, is not only God fulfilling these promises, but even when there are challenges that are really always the result of our shortcomings, mankind's shortcomings, falling short of our side of the covenant. And so to recap real quickly what we've covered, God created heavens and the earth and mankind in his image. That's important to understand. We didn't create God, God created us. And that sounds so obvious, like, oh, we're a church, duh. That's actually a very profound statement for you to process in your brain. We didn't create God, God created us. And that's a very, very important thing to understand. We broke covenant with God. The fall of man, we saw the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3, and then of course mankind continued to rebel, and God allowed the flood, and then he restored mankind, and then man messed up again, and there's the Tower of Babel situation, all these kinds of things, and then of course God lays out his 7 promises to Abraham, and he establishes them as covenant promises. And I already covered very quickly the first part of these bullet points of how these promises were fulfilled. But then during the book of 1st and 2nd Kings that we studied last week, we see when I say our, I mean collective mankind, we fail to fulfill our side of the deal. And so ultimately, again, a very patient God, after generations and generations of sending prophets and teachers and people to say, please, please, please get back on track, God finally says, that's it. And he puts the Israelite people into exile. And it's done in 2 phases, and we learned the details of that, but that's the basic premise. Again, this is the highlights of the highlights. And then in the book of Ezra, we see that God fulfills his promise through Jeremiah, because he said, I'm going to return the people to the land. And then Zerubbabel begins to rebuild the temple, and Ezra begins to restore the priesthood. So that's kind of where we left off on Wednesday night as we continue our story, as we continue to follow God fulfilling these promises to Abraham and looking at the Bible as a book. And today we're going to look at the book of Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah it happens historically in the same timeline as the second half of Ezra. Of course, the first half of Ezra is the restoring of the temple happened first, and then several decades later, actually, Ezra goes to Jerusalem to restore the priesthood. And actually, Nehemiah was there as a contemporary to Ezra. And we see that in the book of Nehemiah because they're actually together at one point, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's important to understand that God had a purpose behind all of these things. God's purpose is, again, reestablishing or reviving these promises that he made to Abraham to rebuild and rekindle and restore Israel in preparation for fulfilling his 7th great promise. And so we're going to kick right into the content here today, because we have a lot to cover. Nehemiah's 13 chapters, but they're really packed full of stuff. And so I want to get right into the content. In Nehemiah chapter 1, says, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah, with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted before the God of heaven. And so the very premise of the book, at the very beginning, we find Nehemiah is back in Persia, and he gets news and he gets wind of what's going on. He gets relatives that have come back, have visited Jerusalem, and they come back, and he's just anxious for a report. And you have to remember the historical landscape here. He didn't live in with like CNN on his TV every night. He didn't have like TikTok to go and look and see what was going on. He didn't have any kind of connectivity. So his only source of news were these returning folks. And you got to believe that there was a part of him that was like, let's see the wall restored to its great glory. Now, of course, this is a modern picture, but you can get a sense of what it may have looked like in its glory. And he's like, let's see this wall restored. Let's see how that would look. He's very excited because he knows that about 50 years earlier, Zerubbabel had gone back with a bunch of people. About 50,000 people had gone back. And they did rebuild the temple, but I think there was this sort of inherent expectation that they were repairing the kingdom. They were repairing the city. They were repairing the walls. But what happened is he gets this report that the walls are in ruins, that the walls are just have not even been attended to. Now, there are some people that think, well, does that mean there was a second attack and that these burning of the walls was more recent? Maybe some people there. But we know that when Nebuchadnezzar came in and overtook Jerusalem, he put not one stone on another on those walls, and he burned the gates. So it appears to me as though they've just been in shambles for over 100 years. Either way, it broke Nehemiah's heart. And it's interesting because we're going to learn from the book here that Nehemiah is very much a man of action. He's very much a man who has strategy and plans and is a driver. He goes and gets it done. But his instinct, and this is what's so convicting to me, his instinct when he heard this terrible news was to pray. His instinct when he heard this very challenging report was to get on his knees and to pray to his God. And I got to tell you that I am so convicted because that is not my instinct. It should be. Like, that's what I've learned from Nehemiah. But my instinct is like, okay, let's get a plan. Let's get a solution. Let's get some strategy. Let's get people together. Let's come up with ideas. Let's get a think tank. Let's brainstorm. And none of those things are wrong, but they should all be done in the context under this greater umbrella of total reliance on God and on prayer. And I think that the biggest takeaway today you can see here in the life of Nehemiah is that he was such a man of faith. He relied completely on God. And again, this is a very talented, driven leader, but his instinct in these moments of challenge was to rely on God. So what does he do? Well, he goes in his prayer. I think we get a lot of insights about Nehemiah from this prayer. So a lot of our reading today, I'm going to highlight sections of the book and just read kind of highlighted scriptures. But here I wanted to read all of Nehemiah's prayer because I think we get great insight into the historical perspective, the things we've already covered in this discussion. And I think we see how it influenced Nehemiah's perspective. And we also get insight into his focus on how he's going to solve the problems that they're facing. So in beginning of verse 5, then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great, awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keeps his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant. The prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm trying to follow along on the slide, but also read because this part of the slide is cut off on my version. So I apologize for being a little distracted there. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even your exiled people at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there, and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for your name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king. And so this is important because Nehemiah recognizes we're where we are because we messed up. We're where we are because we understand you're a God of covenant. God, you did not fail. God, you kept your promises. In fact, you were amazingly patient. But we messed up. I messed up. Our people, we messed up. And he took responsibility for the fall of Israel. He took responsibility for the shortcomings. He recognized that it wasn't God being unjust. It was God being just to his covenant. And then he says, okay, God, I want to come up with a solution here. And then he prays specifically for God to give him favor in the eyes. And the word "this man" at the end of verse 11 is he's referring to the king of Assyria, because then it says he's cupbearer to the king. Again, that's like, why is that even in the Bible? Well, it's important to know that God had called someone who he had already placed in this incredibly influential position. He had the ear of the king. He had the trust of the king. He was in charge of tasting the king's wine to make sure the king wasn't poisoned. There was an immense amount of trust that he had established there. And so he was able to go and get audience with the king and ask for the king to help solve this problem. So first thing he does, as we mentioned earlier, his instinct, he goes back and he prays and he says, God, give me strength and give me success in the eyes of the king. So he knows what he's going to do. He's going to go and talk to the king and he's going to request help. And as the cupbearer, of course, he had that access. And so the whole book of Nehemiah, there's a lot there. There's a lot we will cover today, but there's a lot we probably won't have time for. But the overarching theme for me is that it's about revival. It's a formula for revival. We see this pattern of revival actually repeated several times in the book of Nehemiah. We're going to highlight a few of those things, and kind of as an homage to Kurt, since Kurt hasn't been able to preach for a couple weeks because he had some minor surgery, and as Kurt points out, it's only minor when it's other people getting it. So maybe in his mind it was major surgery. But anyway, one of the things I learned from Kurt very early on, or if you've observed in the lessons he's done since he's been here, Kurt is very creative. He infuses his lessons with some creativity and some wordplay. So I'm just going to go out on a limb and tell you I tried to do that today. I hope I didn't fall short. If I fall on my face, blame Kurt. But I'm giving it an effort to go out as somebody who's been influenced by him as a mentor and a leader. I'm going to give it a shot. So the first ingredient in the recipe for revival is that God raises up his man. God chose Nehemiah. God placed Nehemiah in this position probably before Nehemiah was even born, certainly raised him up. God had orchestrated these things throughout the ages, and he had Nehemiah at exactly the right place, at exactly the right time to approach the king. And that's exactly what Nehemiah does in chapter 2. He approaches the king. He basically says, and it's interesting, he goes up to the king, he's about to talk to him, and again, he prays a third time. It says how he turned and he prayed because he was scared. You think, well, he's cupbearer. Why would he be scared? Because he was going to ask for something radical. He was going to do something, that would have been unthinkable culturally. He was going to ask to leave his position as the cupbearer and go to this foreign land to repair the walls of Jerusalem. And so he's a lot nervous, but he prays. God gives him strength. And then in verse 6 of chapter 2, it says, then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. It pleased the king to send me. Why? Because God had made the king favorably disposed to Nehemiah's request. He made him favorably disposed because of Nehemiah's persistence, but also because of his prayers. But God needed a man of God. He needed to have somebody that was going to go and take point. Remember, The original group had gone back almost 50 years earlier. They'd already been back. The captives had come back to Zion. They were like men who dream. They rebuilt the temple, but the walls were still in shambles. Somehow they lost that pep in their step. Somehow they went back with a dream, and that dream sort of fizzled out. And they weren't getting the progress. They weren't getting it done. So God called his man Nehemiah to make it happen. He said, I need someone to rebuild in this revival. And if you read in verse 11, I don't have the scripture on the screen, but if you read in verse 11, he references, when he was in Jerusalem and he's there, he's out walking around the wall. He says, during the night, verse 12, with a few others, I had not told anyone what my God had put on my heart to do for Jerusalem. So you see, he even credits the fact that his passion and desire to go and fix these walls was because God had put it on his heart. God had put it on his heart that there's an issue, there's a problem, my wall needs to be rebuilt. And so he sent Nehemiah to go and rebuild the wall. But then what happens is God's man rolls out God's plan. God establishes a plan and he executes his plan through the leadership that he has here. God's man rolls out God's plan. And again, we see that from the scripture I just referenced, that God had put it on Nehemiah's heart to want to go and repair the walls. And we see this in several areas here throughout the next couple of chapters. But Nehemiah sets up a plan. The first thing he does is he goes and he assesses the problem. Right? He goes out there and he walks around the wall. He does it at night. He doesn't tell anybody why he's in town. He just wants to know how bad is it really. And he assesses the problem. And then in verse 17 of chapter 2, he says, then he said to them, you see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we'll no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. And they replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. So Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem and the king allows it. If you go back and keep reading the rest of the story, the king gave him all the resources too. The king gave him letters of introduction. The king gave him building materials. I mean, the king really supported him beyond just letting him go. The king got behind him and said, yeah, go get it done, make it happen. And then he gets there and he assesses the problem and it's worse than he realizes. So he finally addresses the people. He says, guys, I got a plan. I got a strategy, but we got to get it done. But by the way, we have the support of the king. We have the support of we have the resources we need to make this happen. And we dig into chapter 3. Nehemiah rolls out a very specific plan. He basically divides and conquers. He divides all these different sections of the wall with the gates, and then he says, "Okay, team, you go build this. You go build." It's kind of like our house churches. You got Team Bowles up there in Hammond. You got Team Simmons there in Cherville. You got Team Breford in Crown Point. We're called to build our part of the wall, right? I mean, that's really what we're trying to do. And he says, "Got to go build your section." And then there's you got the sheep gate, right, in chapter 3, verse 1, and the fish gate in verse 3, and the Jeshana gate, which I don't know what that is, but it sounds fun, in verse 6. The Valley Gate, that sounds like cool. It sounds like it's in Southern California, right? Totally, for sure. The Valley Gate. The Valley Gate in verse 13. And then in verse 14 of chapter 3 of Nehemiah, the Dung Gate. Woohoo! Yes! The Dung Gate was repaired by Malkijah, son of Rechab, ruler of the district of Beth Hekkerim. He built it and put its doors with their bolts and bars in place. And I love this insight because I've got to believe that the Dung Gate was not a very favorable job. The Dung Gate was not like the choice job that everybody signed up for. I went to got my advanced degree so I could build the Dung Gate. And yet God put a leader in charge of rebuilding the Dung Gate. And, sometimes that's leadership, right? Sometimes that's the role that we have as leaders, is that we have to pick up whatever the need is. And honestly, I think as Christians, we're all called to lead at some level, right? So the point there is we can't always pick which gate we're going to jump in on, but we need to jump in on a gate. So God had his man. He's rolling out this plan. He's getting everybody together. He's getting everybody on board. And then what happens is opposition comes and they try to ban. The opposition tries to ban them. And that's what happens first in chapter 2, verse 19. But when Sanballat and Horonite, I'm sorry, these names are crazy. Tobiah the Ammonite, the official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it. They mocked and ridiculed us. What is it you're doing? They asked. Are you rebelling against the king? So right away, they're mocked. Nehemiah is mocked, and this is before any rebuilding had even started. And they accused falsely. They accuse him of rebellion against the king, when we know for a fact from reading the scriptures beforehand that the king supported him wholeheartedly, gave him letters of introduction. These guys had to know that too. It's not like he's hiding those letters. The letters that gave him safe passage, the letters that allowed him to walk into town with resources and building materials. They know he's not rebelling against the king, but they're trying to stir the pot. They're trying to create problems for the people. They're trying to, I guess the old saying, haters gonna hate, right? But that's exactly what's happening here. In chapter 4, in verse 1 and 2, when Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria, he said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" So again, we see this opposition very directly, very in your face. These guys aren't going to be able to do anything. Who do they think they are? But he was angry. He was incensed, which is actually kind of code for he was threatened. He was threatened because his way of life was perhaps going to change. But this is a takeaway that's a hard pill to swallow. Because if you think about it, in times of true revival, there is almost always opposition. In times of true revival, there's almost always opposition. And so if we're not experiencing any opposition, we have to ask ourselves, are we engaging in the elements of true revival? Are we rebuilding in a way that is bringing honor and glory to God on a daily basis, so much so that those who oppose it have no choice but to lash back? It's interesting. When I was in college, I just left college, and I was my first little campus ministry job. I should use air quotes. It was a job. I think I made $250 a month was my salary. So it was like a poverty job, poverty. But it was great. I was so encouraged. I was so inspired. I was so excited. I really wanted to go and work for the church. And I was working with college students in Cincinnati, Ohio. Kurt and Patty had asked me to move from Lincoln to Ohio, and I was working with the college students. And one of the things I realized right away was that this ministry was in desperate need of a revival. They had been they've been shrinking in size, which happens in campus ministries because you have matriculation, people graduate and they leave. But hopefully you're converting more people than are graduating. That's the idea of building a campus ministry, but that had not been happening. And the campus ministry there at UC had just lost some key leaders, both to matriculation as well as to other things, and it was really struggling. They hadn't really seen very many people become Christians for a long time. And, that's the situation I came into. And I moved there in May, and summertime isn't necessarily a great time to move campus ministry, but we actually had a pretty good summer that year. We had a few baptisms and things were starting to get going. And so what I wanted to do in the fall was I wanted to have a revival, but I thought, if they go onto our own campus and try to turn their minds around, there's just too much baggage there. And the cool thing was the University of Cincinnati was on a quarter system. So it started like 3 weeks later than most colleges. It started like the end of September, like the third week of September. So other colleges in the area were starting like right after Labor Day. So I got a playbook that I stole from Kurt, and it was the playbook that we used when we sent the mission team to Lincoln, Nebraska. And I had every single lesson Kurt had ever taught to prepare our mission team in the first year. Well, I think 8 months that they were there in Lincoln. I had every lesson in this book, this hardbound book that I kept. And so I went back through that and I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. There's another campus across the river. It's only 20 minutes away. It's in northern Kentucky, but it's actually just right across the river. It's called Northern Kentucky University. And they start right after Labor Day. So we have 3 weeks where they're going to be in school and the UC students have nothing to do. So I put together a mission team, and I did it all. Anybody that wanted to be a part of the mission team could be a part of it, but they had to come to the first meeting, and I told them exactly what the commitment was going to be, exactly what they needed to do. And it was intense. We got together twice a day for prayer times. We were on campus for 4 to 6 hours a day, sharing our faith with various people. We had a Bible talk 2 or 3 times a day on campus at NKU. And we did that for 3 weeks. And it was incredible. I think we had 5 baptisms in that 3-week period at NKU, including one sister who's now married. Her name is Hillary, by the way, and she's married our friend Bill. In 1995, they got married. I did their wedding, Bill and Hillary, and her kid sister's name is Chelsea. So, just swallow that one. But Bill and Hillary are now elders and elders' wife in the Cincinnati church. I converted a guy named John Cleghorn, who ended up leading the youth and family in Cincinnati forever. And then he moved to Chicago, and he actually studied with this guy that we all know named Anthony Testa. This guy, John Cleghorn, baptized Anthony Testa. So you see how the impact of that ministry. It was just incredible. But I was there like in the middle of the second week. We were having this mission team, and I was escorted off campus by armed security guards. And I remember I was just sitting there having a conversation with somebody in the cafeteria. I wasn't even talking or preaching or doing a Bible talk in public speaking of any kind. I was just sitting there having a conversation with somebody. We weren't actually even studying the Bible at that point. We were just chatting. But apparently somebody that I had previously studied with had a bad attitude about what they'd been taught. They didn't like it. So they went and reported that I didn't belong on this campus. And those security guards came and said, "You got to leave." And I'd been persecuted. I had articles written, but I'd never been escorted off by armed guards. So I left, and then I went and had a Sunday at church. I had a conversation with one of the brothers in the church who happened to be one of the top attorneys in the city of Cincinnati. And he said, he said, what did they say they would do if you didn't leave? I said, they said they'd arrest me. And he laughed and he goes, "I wish you'd have let them arrest you because you'd own the campus if they had done that." So then I felt empowered legally to go back. So I did. I went back for the rest of the mission team time. But we had a campus ministry at Northern Kentucky University the rest of my time as campus minister for the Cincinnati church. And I don't know what's going on in Northern Kentucky University now from a campus ministry perspective. But from that little initiative, it kept going. But we faced this opposition up to and including armed guards banning me from campus. So it happens when you try to have revival, there will be opposition, and the opposition may try to ban you. And then they even threatened to kill. In the book of Nehemiah, they even threatened to kill them. These opposers threatened to kill some of the Jews, and that's in chapter 4, verse 11. Also, our enemies said, before they know it or see it, we will be right there among them, and we will kill them and put an end to the work. I mean, they were seriously opposing what God was trying to build. So once again, God's man, Nehemiah, forms a plan. God gives him a plan, puts a plan on his heart, and he divides the troops. He says, okay, half of you are going to build, and the other half are going to just stand there with spears and swords and protect the builders. And then he even got to the point where people that were building would have a shovel in one hand and a sword in the other. That's what he says in verse 17. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. So it got to the point where, they actually had to physically defend themselves while they were working. And they did it. Again, God's man formed a plan. They came together to overcome the opposition that tried to ban them. And then they came to the last part of revival, which is together we can. Recognizing it takes a collective effort. It doesn't happen when just one person gets a fire in their belly. It doesn't happen if the leader comes in with this great vision and this great dream and this great passion, but it doesn't catch fire. It doesn't cause revival. In fact, that's in part what happens in the book of Nehemiah. If you read the whole thing, we'll kind of get to that on our wrap up. When he leaves town, people's convictions start to waver, and that's not what you want in a true revival. You want to recognize that together, collectively, we can. And in this case, in chapter 6 of verse 15 and 16, so the wall was completed on the 25th day of however you say that, In 52 days, when all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. This is amazing. 50 years before, people came back. They did rebuild the temple to their credit, but the walls were still in shambles for decades. Nehemiah comes into town and they get it done in 52 days because of strong leadership. Revival can happen quickly, and you can look radically different one day to the next when you're engaged in true revival. It wasn't this gradual change and shift that took 3 or 4 generations to correct. They turned on a dime and gave you 5 cents change. They were serious about revival. And so we see this pattern emerge in Nehemiah over a couple of times, actually, because Ezra and Nehemiah, of course, they restore the law to Israel. So in Nehemiah chapter 8, we see the public reading of the law. They go out and they read, remind people what the book of Moses said, and people are convicted, and you see people really changing. And in chapter 9, you see the public rereading of chunks of the law, and then public confession of sin. And then I would like to recommend for folks, we don't have time today to do it. I would like to recommend that people read Nehemiah. If you can't read the whole book, if you don't want to throw off your reading plan, just read chapter 9 as a part of our class, because what happens during the public prayer, it's amazing. They basically, in their prayer, recount the entire story that we've just been talking about, almost all the way back to Adam and Eve, all the way through Noah and Moses. They recount all of it and how God was working and promising, and they were messing up. And their prayer is very much about retelling that history and understanding where they stood in the context of that history, and recognizing that God was here to restore his promised land. He was here to restore them to those promises that he had made to Abraham. In Nehemiah chapter 9, we see corporate prayer and worship, which is, I think, a critical part of revival. And as I mentioned earlier, also corporate confession of sin. I mean, these guys didn't hold back. They just wanted to get it out. They didn't want their sin to continue to weigh them down and hurt them in their relationship with God. And then 10 through 13 is the restoration of the law. They read the law. They apply the law. There's some issues with the way money's handled. There's some issues with some other things that they address. And then ultimately in chapter 13, Nehemiah comes back again and reasserts himself on this issue around the marrying of foreign wives. And he makes it very clear at the end of chapter 13 that the reason he's so frustrated is because it's exactly what destroyed them in the first place. He says that specifically in chapter 13, that because this is what destroyed Solomon. This is what got us off the rails in the beginning. Why would you keep doing it? And so that, I think, is our big takeaway. Again, this is the highlights of the highlights, right? There's a lot more to the book of Nehemiah, and hopefully when you get to it in your annual reading plan this year, you remember some of these things, and it triggers some memories and some excitement and some zeal. But it is a recipe for revival. It's a recipe for remembering that God raises up his man. God rolls out his plan. He uses his man to roll out his plan. The opposition tries to ban, and ultimately together we can. And I'll say this as I wrap things up here. I really believe that God sent Kurt and Patty to lead our church. I really believe that with all my heart. I believe he is God's man. She is God's woman. They're together. By the way, I use God's man collectively, mankind. Please don't get frustrated that I keep saying man. It just rhymes. It could be man or woman, but it rhymes if I use the word man. God raises up his man to roll out his plan. There may be opposition so that we can be together. But I believe that Kurt and Patty were sent here by God. I know Kurt has a plan. And I like to believe the greatest opposition so far has been my resistance. Not directly. I mean, I love Kurt and I'm super loyal, but have I really been all in? Have I really given it all my effort? Have I really gotten whatever you want to do? I'm there. Let's go make it happen. That needs to be our attitude. And then we may face external opposition. If we really start making an impact in the community, you will face opposition. But remember that together we can see revival in our individual relationship with God, our individual hearts, and revival in the church. Bow with me and let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you so much for this opportunity that we have to pray to you. Thank you that you are a God who loves us. Thank you, you are a God who listens to us, even though we are in our flesh, we're messed up. We make constant mistakes. We fall short on a regular basis, and yet you listen. You hear our prayers. You give us access to you through the blood of your Son. You give us the opportunity to continually revive in our hearts and revive collectively. And Father, I pray today we take this lesson from the book of Nehemiah to heart, and that it lights a fire in each one of us to want to go out every single day and be our best for you, because we know that together we can. We love you so much. We thank you, and it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.